Welcome back. We've come to the final episode in this series, and I think it's fitting that we end with what may be the most important question of all. Over the last five episodes, we've talked about what financial freedom really means. We've challenged the common belief that it's simply about escaping work or accumulating wealth. We've talked about defining the life you're trying to build, creating systems that sustain wise financial decisions, recognizing meaningful progress, and imagining how financial freedom can give you greater control over your time. But all of those conversations eventually lead to one final question: what's the point of financial freedom? Because if we've spent years working toward it, surely it's worth asking what it's ultimately for. I've noticed that many people spend decades preparing financially for freedom, but spend very little time preparing personally for what they'll do once they have it. They know how to accumulate resources. They've thought much less about how those resources will shape the rest of their lives. And I think that's a conversation worth having. As you listen today, I'd like you to imagine something. Picture yourself 10 years from now. You've reached the financial goals you've been working toward. Your investments have grown. Your financial plan has unfolded as expected. You're no longer making decisions primarily because of financial necessity. Now ask yourself one simple question: what kind of person do you hope you've become by then? Notice I didn't ask what you'll own, or where you'll live, or how much money you'll have. I asked who you'll become. Let's come back to that before we finish. If these conversations have helped you think differently about financial freedom, but you're wondering what all of this looks like in your own situation, I'd like to invite you to schedule a discovery call with our team. It's an opportunity for us to understand where you are today, where you're trying to go, and determine whether working together would be the right next step. You'll find the link in the description. One of the reasons I wanted to end this series with this conversation is because I think we sometimes confuse a milestone with a destination. Financial freedom is an important milestone. It's something worth planning for, sacrificing for, and stewarding wisely. But it's still a milestone. Imagine you're on a long journey and you finally reach a mountain pass you've been working toward for years. You celebrate because you've made it that far. But you don't stop there. You look ahead because the mountain pass wasn't the reason for the journey. It simply opened the way to what comes next. I think financial freedom is very much like that. It removes certain constraints from your life, but it doesn't automatically tell you how to use the freedom you've gained. That decision still belongs to you. One thing I've observed is that every kind of freedom eventually asks the same question: now what? If you suddenly had complete control over your schedule, now what? If financial pressure no longer dictated your career choices, now what? If you had more time than you've ever had before, now what? Freedom doesn't answer those questions. It simply creates the opportunity to answer them intentionally. That's why I don't believe financial freedom automatically produces a meaningful life. It simply removes some of the barriers that may have prevented you from pursuing one. Purpose still has to come from somewhere deeper than your financial position. Earlier in this series, we talked about how money is a tool rather than a destination. I think that idea becomes even more important here. Money doesn't create generosity, but it can expand your ability to be generous. Money doesn't create wisdom, but it can increase the impact of wise decisions. Money doesn't create meaningful relationships, but it can give you greater freedom to invest time in them. Money doesn't create purpose, but it can remove obstacles that once kept you from pursuing it. That's why financial freedom is so valuable. Not because it changes who you are overnight, but because it expands your capacity to live more consistently with the values you already hold. In many ways, financial freedom simply gives your priorities more room to breathe. And if you've enjoyed this series and would like more conversations like these, I'd appreciate it if you take a moment to like the video and subscribe. My goal is to keep sharing practical insights that help you make wiser financial decisions and build a life that's intentional, not just financially successful. As a financial planner, people sometimes assume my goal is simply to help clients accumulate more wealth. Of course, building financial security matters, but if that were the end of the conversation, I don't think we'd be serving people particularly well. The deeper question has always been this: what kind of life is your financial plan making possible? Is it helping you become more present with your family? Does it allow you to mentor younger professionals who could benefit from your experience? Does it give you the freedom to serve your community more generously? Does it create space to pursue meaningful work because you want to, not because you have to? Those are the conversations that become increasingly important once financial necessity begins to fade. Because eventually, success is measured less by what you've accumulated and more by how intentionally you're investing the life you've been given. If you've watched this series from the beginning, you might notice we've come full circle. In our very first episode, we asked whether financial freedom was about being free from something or being free for something. I think now we have our answer. Financial freedom certainly frees us from some things, from unnecessary financial anxiety, from being trapped by every paycheck, from having every major life decision dictated by financial necessity. Those are meaningful gifts. But those freedoms are valuable because they make something else possible. They free us for deeper relationships, for meaningful contribution, for wiser stewardship, for becoming increasingly intentional about how we spend our time, our attention, our resources, and ultimately our lives. To me, that's the point of financial freedom. Not that life becomes easier, but that you're better able to live it on purpose. Let me take you back to the question I asked earlier. When you imagine yourself reaching financial freedom someday, what kind of person do you hope you've become? Because perhaps that's the question that should guide every financial decision you make today. Not simply, will this make me wealthier, but will this help me become the kind of person who uses wealth wisely? I believe that's a much more meaningful way to think about financial planning. Because financial freedom isn't the highest goal, it's a gift, it's a responsibility, and an opportunity to invest your life more intentionally in the people and purposes that matter most. If you've been with me through all 6 episodes, I hope you've noticed that we've been talking about much more than money. We've really been talking about the kind of life we're trying to build. Money matters, planning matters, investing matters, but ultimately they matter because they help support something even greater. A life lived with wisdom, a life lived with intention, and a life where financial freedom becomes not the finish line, but the freedom to faithfully pursue what matters most. Thank you for joining me throughout this series. And if you're ready to move from learning about financial freedom to actually building a plan that's designed around your own goals, I'd love to invite you to schedule a discovery call with Beacon Wealth Advisory. Every person's journey is different, and meaningful financial planning starts with understanding your life, your priorities, and what financial freedom truly looks like for you. If you'd like to explore that together, you'll find the link in the description. I'm Mon Casas from Beacon Wealth Advisory. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you again in another conversation.